school funding plan. Unfortunately, it misses the mark. So tonight, with the help of this lineup, we'll learn more about what went wrong and what to fix. But fair warning, it won't be easy. So with that, I'm really glad to turn this over to John Patterson, who will guide us through the evening.
Thank you very much, Susie. Great to be on board here. And let's start with our presentation. So next slide, please. So before we get into our deep discussion tonight, there are some vocabulary words that we have to go over so that when those of us in the education circles throw these around, you know exactly what we're talking about. So first off, there was a young man named Nathan DeRolf who in the early 1990s was a student at Northern Local in Perry County, just outside of Columbus. The argument was that Ohio was not funding its schools properly. And there were 4 Supreme Court rulings to this effect. And it was deemed unconstitutional. So with that as a background, there would be some other funding formulas until finally we get to the fair school funding formula under which we're now operating. So one of the issues with the DeRolf decisions was this whole notion of adequacy, or what does it cost to educate a student? It hadn't been addressed. If you were going to plan a household budget, you definitely want to plan things like your mortgage payment, your car payment, the grocery bill, that sort of thing. The Fair School Funding Plan does encompass all aspects of a child's education. And the base cost, and we'll get into that shortly, is critically important, and it's all spelled out. It's transparent and it's justifiable. But what is adequate? We'll find that out shortly here. Then the next question that came out of DeRolf was this whole notion of equity, that there is a shared responsibility between the state and the local school districts to bear the cost of educating a student. No 2 districts are alike. So some districts with greater wealth will have to contribute more, to be fair. Other districts with lesser wealth, and when I say wealth, we'll get into how that's determined shortly. Lesser wealth districts are going to ask the state to commit a little bit more. So it's equitable, but it's not equal. And there's a difference between those 2 concepts. So base costs, next word here. Without the add-ons, without the categoricals, and we're going to explain those here shortly, this would be the cost of educating a typical student. This would be the cost of teachers and their insurance, and the superintendent and their insurance benefit package, the square footage of the school, the janitors, the school librarian, school resource officer, everything that would pertain to educating a kid, even an EMIS coordinator, school resource officer, all of that is put into the base cost so that we can determine what this should be. And by the way, the average teacher salaries that's a statewide average, and we threw out the exceedingly high ones and the exceedingly low ones to come up with a state average that is fair for all. Now, you're going to hear Michael and Ryan talk about the local capacity. And this is what a district ought to be able to come up with. And it's determined by a district's property wealth and their income wealth. That was another issue with the DeRolf decision, that we relied too much on property valuations to determine local capacity. Well, to be more fair, we blended those together to get a more accurate picture of what a local district's ability to make its fair share be in the long run. Now, there's a local share, and obviously that's what the local districts should be paying. So if we know what the cost is, total cost of the student, base cost with categoricals, we'll get into that, and then we subtract from that essentially the local share, then the state would fill in the rest. So you can see that in the next 2 bullet points. Next slide, please. So categoricals, also called add-ons, or the other things that we need to consider. This transportation costs, it's English language learners, it's gifted students, all those things. It's economically disadvantaged students that have to be adjusted to ensure that every child in Ohio gets a fair education. Now, the guarantee, and Dr. Hanlon and Mr. Pendleton are going to be discussing this. There has to be an insurance policy, if you will, so that no district loses money should there be some extreme issues that arise, say power plants close, industry moves out, or something catastrophic, loss of students. Definitely have to be a guarantee there so that districts don't lose money, so that they can continue to provide an education for the students. We're also going to get into the 10% floor, that the share of the base costs must be borne by the local district, and that can be up to 10%. This is unvoted millage, and we'll get into that shortly here. But it's critically important to know that there's considerable discussion right now out there about tinkering with this, which would disrupt not only local funding for schools, but also funding for parks, cemetery levies, township levies, everything else, when we're talking about a complex taxing formula as we have in Ohio for all things local. And then the 20 mil floor, to be eligible for the state funding, school districts must be maintaining the millage of at least 20 mils. And finally, the inside millage refers to the first 10 mils that are collected by the local taxing authorities. And there's some dispute about this in this legislature now, as to is this where we want to be or not. That discussion is taking place on the side, because remember, you can't fund school districts unless you have some sort of a taxing means, and there's a lot of discussion about this. Next slide, please. So as Susie mentioned, Speaker Cup and I realized that we couldn't do this by ourselves. We wanted to connect with the locals who do this every day. And if you look on this distinguished list here, and this is just page 1, you will see bottom left-hand corner is our own Dr. Michael Hanlon from Chardon, that these folks were treasurers and superintendents from around the state, wealthy district, not so wealthy districts, urban districts, rural districts. We wanted to get a cross section, and their instructions were to create a pure formula. Nobody was going to get any special breaks in this. It was going to be whatever the formula rendered at the end of our work. So you can see where they're from around the state. Next slide, please. And on this slide, you will see next to the bottom on the left-hand side, our own distinguished Ryan Pendleton. And Ryan and Mike have been instrumental in putting all this together from the very beginning. And my goodness gracious, the effort that all these folks, but especially those two, have put together have been incredibly important. So all around the state, different types, great formula. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the Dr. Mike Hanlon to take us through the agenda for tonight and share that with Mr. Pendleton. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was muted for a moment. Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening with the League of Women Voters. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge both John Patterson and Bob Cupp, both representatives who reached across the aisle in 2017 and said that there needs to be a better way to fund schools in Ohio, and agreed to formulate that work group that you just learned about to tackle the challenge of school funding in Ohio and attempt to address it in a manner that was justifiable, transparent, understandable, amendable, and so on, in order to meet the needs of Ohio students. So what we plan to go over tonight is the roadmap for school funding in Ohio, talk about the impacts of Governor DeWine's as proposed budget, the priorities from the perspective of the Fair School Funding Plan, which is to maintain the integrity of the funding formula and certainly to educate students in Ohio at the very highest level, and what you can do to become involved. Also, the Fair School Funding Plan website is noted there at the bottom of the slide. If you wish to visit that, we have some information and resources there. Next slide, please, and I'll just touch on these briefly. Dr. Patterson indicated that if you look back since the 1990s, there was, and I won't spend time going through each of these different funding formulas, but there were a series of funding formulas working through 2011. And next slide, please, all the way up through 2021. The moral of the story, or the essence of the story here in all of these funding formulas, is primarily the over-reliance on what we term residual budgeting, which very simply put is, the state legislature looking at the money that they have available to allocate to traditional public schools and then backing into a per pupil amount and funding that is available for the school districts. Up through 2021, in essence, we had a situation where we did not have a funding formula that was working for almost all of the school districts in Ohio. They were all either capped or guaranteed, and the formula was simply not functioning. Next slide, please. The work group began, as Dr. Patterson noted, in 2017 with the charge to address this. There were significant meetings of this work group with not only the members of the work group, but bringing in expert resources such as Dr. Fleeter and representatives from the Department of Education, business groups, charter school operators, other experts and consultants to assist in the process of developing what was then termed the Fair School Funding Plan. That group also presented a significant amount of testimony in both the House and the Senate, resulting in the implementation of the Fair School Funding Plan. Next slide, please. There have been some truly powerful outcomes with the implementation of Fair School Funding Plan. It is in law, it is Ohio's funding formula. There's been approximately $1.5 billion increase in state funding since fiscal 22. And in this most recent biennial budget, we saw a 12% increase in traditional pre-K through 12 school funding. The bottom bullet point on that slide indicates for you the per pupil expenditures in various fiscal years, and you can see the growth that occurred in the base cost per student as each year progressed. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the roadmap and what constitutes the Fair School Funding Plan, there are really three pillars to this plan. The base cost saw a complete overhaul in the costs that were necessary to educate a child in Ohio. And we're talking about the typical student now. We're not talking about the overlays of categorical costs like special education, English language learners, gifted education, and so on, but the fundamental cost to educate a student. The second question that was answered by the work group was, how do we then determine what is an appropriate balance? The Constitution of the state of Ohio calls for the funding of education to be a shared responsibility between the state and the local school district. And the work group spent a great deal of time on determining how do we evaluate the capacity of each district in Ohio. And it's interesting to note that prior to Fair School Funding Plan, a district like Chardon, I'll use as an example, the amount of funding that it received from the state of Ohio could have been impacted by something that occurred across the state in the Salina local schools, having no direct bearing on our school district, but affecting the funding in our schools. There was a complicated interplay that was occurring among all of the school districts in the state. What Fair School Funding Plan sought to do was to allow each school district to stand on its own, to evaluate its capacity to support public education in its community, and to bear its share of the base cost. And then the third component or third pillar of the Fair School Funding Plan is the categorical funding, as has been mentioned several times. The special needs that exist within each school district and the students within that district, economically disadvantaged students, gifted students, English language learners, special education, transportation costs, and so on, are all categorical funding that is layered onto the base cost in a particular district. Please move forward. And at this point, Ryan, I will turn it to you and you'll talk about the how we've relied on the implementation and the base cost inputs.
All right, thanks, Michael. This is where we are in the phase-in of the 6-year phase-in. There was an acknowledgement that we had designed a roadmap for Ohio. It was comprehensive, and we'll talk a little bit more about the comprehensive nature of where we are today. But the governor's proposal did include the last 2 years of the phase-in. So that's the 83% and the 100%. However, on the next slide, as you move, we're falling short of some expectations here. And one more slide. So House Bill 96 produced these results. This is really high level. Sorry for the spreadsheet, but there to the right on the screen, you see highlighted the traditional school district segment, which is over $8 billion of the $10+ billion budget, received a decrease in funding of just under 1% on the total biennium. Whereas community STEM school, joint vocational school districts, and scholarships range from 11% increase to just under 16% increase. And I know Dr. Fleer's got some additional details there. So if you want to jump to the next slide. These are some things to consider. I won't go into a lot of details here, but in any formula, in any set of simulations, there are a set of assumptions. And those assumptions are what are being debated and formulated through the House right now, and to the amendment process will ultimately be turned over to the Senate and conference committees. So when we look at where things lie with property values, as we know, there's been dramatic increases across Ohio, income levels, enrollment, special education, transportation, and other transportation costs. There's a number of things that we must take into account when appropriately funding any formula. And next slide. This graphic and that quote is going to resonate throughout the rest of our presentation and throughout the rest of the debate through this biennial budget process. The matter of who pays for K-12 education in Ohio remains an ongoing constitutional concern. And you heard former Representative John Patterson talk about the Durolf case and those landmark 4 court cases. When we look at this shared responsibility in Ohio for education, ideally, we would like that cost to be shared 50-50 between the state and the local. It might not have ever reached that 50% mark, but during the Durolf case, that low watermark, highlight low watermark, was about 42%. And if you look at the actual Fair School Funding Plan implementation there in 2022, we were just about at that 42%. Well, those previous markers from the slide before, the state's components of those were updated, but the local side of that equation was not. So the state share of education dropped to 39%. But look what happened the next biennium. We fought hard, we updated inputs, and you see we're back up to that watermark of 42%. And however, we're now staring at a 38, just over 38% state share. And with the governor's proposed budget, we can slide all the way down to 32%. And I'll turn this one more slide here, and then I'll turn it over to Howard. And Howard's got a lot more depth and breadth here on that conversation. Here's some highlights. From the governor's budget, over 80% of the districts, of the 609 districts in Ohio, get wealthier in 26, 27 means less money. Over half of those districts see a decrease in funding in 26 and 27. Again, the state side of the component of this state local share formula are updated, but the local side is not. And then we see that state's voucher program, and I saw a couple questions in the chat that I'm trying to answer, see double-digit increases, and the main component there is the state local share is not applied to those other choice options. Howard, I think that next slide is yours.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Nice, succinct job going through some complicated material here. I hope everybody's following along with this. So, you know, just to finish what Ryan said about that slide with the graph on it, with the plummeting state share, that state share is going down. Just to reiterate what John and Mike and Ryan have been talking about, that both sides of this formula, and I think of the formula having two sides. One is, you know, all the work that the work group did to figure out the cost of educating different kinds of kids and getting them back and forth to school. I think of that as the adequacy side of the formula. And then the other side of the formula is the side which figures out the state and local share. And, you know, throughout, you know, I've started working on school funding in Ohio back in the summer of 1990. And, you know, throughout that time, there's been an understanding that both sides of those formula need to be based on current data. And, you know, updating the base cost from one year to another, you know, used to just be business as usual. It was not a controversial thing. It's only become a controversial thing in the last several years. And I think, you know, part of that, you know, a large part of that is the state not wanting to absorb the cost of, you know, continuing to keep that side of the formula updated. And what you saw with that graph, where, you know, the state share is going to go down to 32.2% in FY27 under the governor's proposal, that is the direct result of updating the data that computes the state and local cost, but not updating the data that determines the state and local share, I'm sorry, but not updating the data that determines the overall cost of the formula. So essentially what you're doing is you're keeping the pie the same size and you're redividing it in, you know, favor of the state share going down and the local share going up. That's what you're seeing. And so when you do that, this is why you see the red numbers in my chart, right? And these numbers are similar to the chart that Mike and Ryan talked about a few slides ago, right? And, you know, my total for this is, you know, over the biennium, there's $103.4 million decrease from FY25. In the numbers that you saw a little bit before, it was showing you the change from 25 to 26 and then from 26 to 27. But if you think about it, if you get a cut, you know, if you lose $1 from 25 to 26, and then you lose another $1 from 26 to 27, you've lost a total of $3 over a 2-year period because you lose that first $1 twice, right? So you're getting a cut of $31.6 million here to the traditional school districts the first year, and then an additional cut on top of that of $40.2 million, right? So the total is $31.6 million once, $31.6 million again, and then $40.2 million compared to the funding where we're at right now. And, you know, all you need to do is just be able to see the difference between red ink and black ink on this slide, and you'll see what's going on under the governor's plan, right? You know, vouchers go up $265 million over the biennium. Community and STEM schools get an increase of almost $222 million over the biennium. Joint vocational school districts, which are public schools, they're getting an increase of $116 million. And then there's some add-ons of, you know, for a couple items that pertain to pre-K special education and special education transportation. Those have been outside the formula ever since I've looked at it in the early 1990s. You know, they're dollars that districts get. They're just as green as the dollars from the formula. But if you include that $104.3 million in the traditional district funding in that bottom row, you end up with a net where it looks like the school districts are just about breaking even, right? But it masks that problem with the formula, that they've not updated the data on the adequacy side, but they have updated the data on the state and local share side and sent that state share plummeting. And that's really what's going on in the governor's budget. And why do community schools and STEM schools, technically they're public schools in the state of Ohio, they get a big increase, but it's because their state share is 100%, right? Because they don't have local taxing authority. Okay, but if you think about it, they educate about 120,000 kids. Traditional school districts educate over 1.4 million kids, and the 1.4 million kids, which are over 80% of the school age kids in Ohio, they're getting a cut, and that smaller percentage of kids is getting a very large increase. For vouchers, it's even bigger, right? And Susie, is this a good time for me to go on my little voucher sidetrack right now? The vouchers are scheduled to get a $265 million increase over this upcoming biennium. And there's, again, no state local share to vouchers. It's all state money now. Okay, this increase, my understanding is it's based on their projection of an 8% increase in the students in the 5 voucher programs that we have. We don't know which voucher programs those kids are going to be coming from or what that's based on, but there has been a massive change in vouchers over the last several years. The amount of funding has gone up dramatically, and just from the FY23 school year to the FY24 school year. FY24 was last year. We're in the FY25 school year right now. Funding for vouchers went from $610 million in FY23 to $962 million in FY24. It's a $352 million increase in just 1 year. Okay. 80% of that was from one of the 5 voucher programs. It's called Ed Choice Expansion. It was originally an income-based voucher program where to qualify, your family had to be at 200 or 250% of the federal poverty level or below. They removed the income requirement from that, and there was an increase. We increased vouchers in 1 year from 83,000 vouchers to 151,000 vouchers. That's an increase of 68,000 in just 1 year. 63,000 of those were in that formerly income-based voucher program, which is no longer income-based. And 96% of those new students who got vouchers under the Ed Choice Expansion program when the income requirement was removed were already attending public schools. So, we had a $350 million increase in just 1 year in payments to families who are already sending their kids to private schools. So I'll be as diplomatic as I can, and I think I might be less polite than John and Ryan and Mike, but if we can direct $350 million, which is basically a handout to families that have already shown they have the ability to send their kids to private schools themselves, I don't see any reason why we can't be putting a proportionate amount of money into the funding pot that educates 80-something% of the students in this state, which is, I'm pointing to my computer right now. You can't see me do that, of course, right? But the top row. If we put more money into the formula, those red numbers will become black numbers, just like the rest of them. They'll turn from negative to positive. And so, that's the landscape of where we're at right now, right? That the refusal to keep the data updated, to keep that adequacy cost moving in sync with how we update the data to figure out the state and local share, that is what's driving down the state share. That is what is causing districts to lose money. And there's been a lot of rhetoric from, I think we'll have a discussion in a little while about the guarantee. There's been a lot of rhetoric about districts losing students. All these numbers, the simulations that are here, and these aren't my numbers, these are numbers that the Legislative Service Commission, which is the legislature's budget office, has put together. They are holding enrollment constant for public schools. So you've got 349 districts that are losing money in the upcoming budget. And that's without any change of enrollment whatsoever. So, the idea that enrollment decline in public schools is what's behind this is, I think the nicest word that I can use right now would be a myth. And so go to the next slide. So, do you guys want to pick up and talk about the guarantee again?
Howard, I just wanted to hit before we do move to
Sure.
guarantees with Ryan. I think it bears repeating that number of students that were already attending non-public schools that took, that then received the voucher increase. I think that's such a key point that really the vast majority of these students were already in non-public schools. We did not see a mass exodus of children fleeing failing public schools. They were already in non-publics and they already had the capacity to attend.
Right. And that reminds me, I had one more little figure I was going to lob out there, which is I made the computation in FY24, 87% of private school students received a voucher, right? And not every private school accepts vouchers. That's, I think that number speaks for itself. So, so again, for those of you out there listening, you can draw your own conclusions. So. You guys want to talk about the guarantee slide then?
Yes, I'm jumping in. I'm trying to respond to some of the Q&A.
Okay.
Here are some of the definitions of what the guarantees are. But if you roll to the next slide, we can see some of the results in why people are on guarantees. So increased guarantees is overall a quick definition of failure in Ohio. When we look at public schools see failure, when lawmakers they see a failure. And these are some of the reasons why districts are on a guarantee. And on the next slide, see some of these specific results. And here's where the numbers are really telling the story. When we started the Fair School Funding Plan journey, prior to that, there were 503 out of the 609 plus districts that were not on the formula. They were either capped or guaranteed. In fiscal 22, that first year of the Fair School Funding Plan, by each one of those guarantees, you can see those numbers, those 4 different guarantees. In 23, we're starting to make some progress there. 24, additional progress. 25, you'll notice we get a little uptick in some guarantees there. And that's because the inputs, that's because of that balance that Howard was talking about was not updated. And then you can see the growth in guarantees in 26 and 27 with the governor's proposal with no inputs being updated. And then to the next slide, and interesting here for us who study this, there's what's called the minimum funding floor. And in talking about this and the folks who advocated this, the general philosophy here is that no traditional public education student should receive less on a per pupil basis than a non-public student. So just think about that funding floor. So that's why the funding floor was at 5% and got increased to 10%. And even that 10% falls short in some circumstances. But because those balanced part of the equation is not being updated, you'll see the growth of the number of districts on that 10% floor. What we're seeing by these last 2 slides mathematically is if you fail to maintain updated inputs, you don't manage that state local share, and we go back to a formula that's not working. And next slide. All right, we'll shift into priorities, what we are advocating for. And Michael, maybe I'll take the first couple slides and then kind of turn it over to you for kind of next steps and how to get involved. So the next slide talks to you about what our funding priorities. So again, thanks to the governor's budget for including the phase-in, right? We knew that this was a 6-year phase-in. And I did see a question in the chat, I'll answer it here, was that some of the testimony today or some of the response from some of the lawmakers said there was never an agreement to update inflation or the inputs. And that's definitely not my recollection, especially since this mathematical formula and all previous school funding formulas in Ohio depend on an inflationary adjustment to maintain that state and local balance. That highlighted middle section there of updating the base cost. This is the technical part of the formula. We must update base cost inputs to balance the growth here. And we know, so if you listen to Michael and my testimony from yesterday, you'll know that we understand the state's revenue position is different. We also understand that the inflation across Ohio on property values is, the first time in decades. We understand that, but we also don't want to see a set of unintended circumstances and new legislation get passed, like House Bill 920, the last time this happened in the 1970s. So that base cost input is so very important. Adopt a permanent educational service center formula. For decades now, on a per pupil basis, ESCs, there's 52 of them around Ohio, have had less money per pupil for year over year and biennium over biennium. They play a critical role, and it was highlighted during the pandemic when a lot of our districts depend on shared services. Next slide. The categorical cost studies, the big takeaway here is, I've been in the business for about 20 years. And as Howard mentioned, he's been doing school funding for a very long time, at least from my research. This is the first time in modern history we have a comprehensive set of resources. So you heard from the very beginning, and this is kind of my new takeaway. This is kind of my new passion here in this conversation. Knowing that we know we have less money, we know we have to make decisions about the future, but let's not leave this mission and fully phasing this in, because for the first time ever, we have a comprehensive set of resources. We've overhauled base cost. We've looked and properly right-sized the state and local share calculation. We have now funded, with the folks of Howard's help and others, professional studies in all of our categoricals. So we have a modern set of information at our fingertips for both taxpayers and lawmakers to the sites we've never had before. It would be such a failure if we wouldn't take full advantage of that. And next slide, please. And then I think if you hit the advance button, you'll see a big call out there. There you go. And I'll pause here for any of our panelists and speakers to jump in here. This really is at the crossroads of where we are. If we fail to update the inflationary components of the formula that are necessary for its operation, not only are we going to be below that watermark of the 1995 DeRolf court case, we're going to be down towards 32%, which is going to shove such a burden onto our local taxpayers. We view this as much as a part of tax relief as I know the tax reform, different initiatives that are being invested. Okay, I'll pause there, turn it over to, I think, Michael to kind of take us home here on next steps.
Yes, thank you. If we could move forward, please. So what is the typical timeline for the budget process that the state engages every 2 years? We've spent a lot of time talking about where we are on the red arrow point, where the governor introduces the budget, and we are currently in the House of Representatives. The budget's making its way through the House Finance Committee, which is where we provided testimony yesterday. We anticipate that there'll be they will consider amendments, and an amendment bill will come out of the House. They're saying by the beginning of April. I know this slide indicates late April, but we expect it to come out earlier this go around. It'll make its way to the House. I'm sorry, to the Senate. The Senate will engage deliberations, work through the same process. Again, they will hear testimony from interested parties on the bill. Likely then they will move a version of the budget out. And most typically then that moves to a conference committee, which is members from the Senate and the House that work out the differences. And then the legislature approves that bill, and it moves to the governor prior to the end of June to implement that, to sign that budget into law. And then the new budget goes into effect July 1. Next slide, please. So what can you do to help? And if we could keep moving forward, please. One common theme, and we have been spending a great deal of time in the State House in the past few weeks, is legislators commenting to us that we need to hear from community members, staff members in schools, parents, and so on about school funding. And the importance of, as has been hit on by both Ryan and Howard, is updating the inputs to the formula. We have template letters here. They need to be communicated. You need to contact your legislators and submit those. I believe that you should be able to get live links off of here, but the letter format's pretty simple. As I speak to groups, I tell them, look, a simple paragraph that opens that thanks the legislator for their work and tells the story of experience that you have in your school district. Number two, that it asks for full implementation of the Fair School Funding Plan along with updating the inputs. And then finally, again, thanking them for their service and recognizing that important decisions have to be made, but that you're seeking their support for public schools. There's also a link to testimony witness slips, and testifying can be a little bit daunting. I know it was for me the first time I did it, but you become experienced with it, and you go in and you speak to legislators, and that does make a significant impact on them. Move forward, please. This is just a sample letter that can be found at the Fair School Funding Plan website, the advocacy tab. I'll leave that for later if we can move forward. Again, involving members of our business community and staff and others within the school community to convey their interest in their public schools. I know in the Chardon area, we've had letters from our retired teachers associations. We've had letters from business leaders and others indicating how important it is to maintain a fair and equitable balance between that state share and that local share. Move forward, please. Again, just a sample template for testimony. Moving forward, please. Again, the key message here is, and it's been brought up several times, is the constitutional balance that needs to maintain to support a high quality education to all students in the state of Ohio. And that is really what our focus is. And in order to do that, we need to fully fund both the phase-in and the input components of the Fair School Funding Plan. Moving forward, please. These are some of the House Finance Committee members. These are the House Finance Committee members, and you can identify those that are in our particular region, Jamie Callender in Lake County, and a few other notables in our area, but these are from across the state. And with that, I will turn it to the panel, or Susie, if you have questions, things that you would like us to address specifically, I think we'd be all happy to do that.
Yeah. Hey, Susie, can I jump in? Because there were a couple of complicated questions about vouchers in the chat that I tried with multiple typos to try to answer. And so it's probably easier for me to just explain it. Somebody asked a question, saying basically, I live in Columbus and people are happy with the voucher system, sort of, paraphrasing your question, what's the big deal? And I typed in an answer, and I think it's worth sharing with everyone that in my mind, what has happened, the voucher system's focus and objective has changed very significantly in the last several years, right? That we had 2 statewide voucher programs that were for, back of another word, regular kids, right? We've got an autism voucher program and the John Patterson special needs program. There's the Cleveland voucher program, which was one of the first 2 or 3 voucher programs in the country. But we've got 2 statewide voucher programs, Ed Choice and Ed Choice Expansion. And those have been around both for 10, 15 years. And Ed Choice started as a program which, to be eligible for it, you had to be attending a low performing school. And the Ed Choice Expansion voucher program started as a program where you had to be a low-income person, okay, from a low-income family. And if you put those 2 things together, you can make an argument that voucher programs are, an equity enhancing option for lower income families that are attending low performing schools that can't afford what I call traditional school choice options, which is paying for private school yourself or moving yourself to a better school district where typically houses are more expensive than where you live right now. To play either of those games, you need to have a certain level of income. So, in my mind, I've spent my entire career trying to figure out how to properly fund public schools, and with the objective of trying to make sure that the school closest to where everyone lives is a good school. The best choice is to take underperforming schools and make them better. But in the meantime, I can kind of, squint and say, okay, a voucher program which is targeted to families that don't have an option besides a low performing school, I can live with that. And what has happened has been the removal of the requirement that you have to attend the low performing school in the Ed Choice program, and the removal of the income requirement in the Ed Choice expansion program. So now what we are doing is we are giving vouchers not to people who are attending low performing schools and who need the help because they can't afford other options. We're just giving vouchers to people that are already attending private schools. We could have a long debate somewhere else about whether that's a good policy or not, but it's obvious that what we have done is we have changed the policy objective of the voucher program in Ohio. And there was another question that said, how did this become such a disproportionate force in school funding over the years? And the answer is that, legislators in leadership have prioritized the voucher program and transforming it in that way. And so, my point here is, we're not going to put the voucher genie back in the bottle. I don't have any illusions that that's going to happen, but I don't want the voucher expansion of helping families that are already able to afford private school themselves to come at the expense of properly funding public schools. And I live in Columbus also. My street, I've got a full set of K-12 options for parochial schools and public schools within 3 blocks of my house, and there are people that use both of them. And so I see this myself, but I don't think if I were to, I know what my neighborhood is. If I wanted to use private schools, I think the people in my neighborhood, we can afford to pay for them ourselves. I don't think we need the state paying for it. So that's my response to that question. And then, Susie, did you want me to talk about property taxes at all?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that there are a number of competing issues that make this complicated. It makes it harder to get adequate resources to be able to actually fund the upgraded costs. So we are now facing, if we had the ideal solution, what would it cost? Can we manage it? And what are the other things that are making it difficult to actually balance? There's a balancing act in creating the right formula, but there's also a balancing act in making sure there's adequate revenue to pay for the solution that we need, so that you can't just get the right school funding plan with also not having the right tax plan. So if you'd like to talk about that balance, a happy balance.
Just briefly, so you've gotten probably more detail from all of us than you expected you might get when you started, when you entered this webinar, at 7 o'clock, about the details of the school funding formula and whatnot. There's a parallel issue right now that is also moving through the legislature in different ways about what to do to create some property tax reform, because we have had very historically unusual increases in property values over the last several years. Probably the last time that we had property values go up for homes the way we have in the last several years was probably in the 1970s. And we ended up with a law called House Bill 920. And so that law has been working largely as intended for probably 45 years. The last several years, it is not working as well to provide protection to taxpayers from increases when their properties are reappraised in the same way it used to. And there's a variety of solutions that are out there to make changes to, what John described earlier as the 20 mil floor. That's a complicated issue. We could have a complete separate webinar on this right now, but I think just for your purposes right now, be aware that that is also going on. And depending on what type of a remedy, if any, the legislature makes for that, it will have reverberations into the school funding formula, because the way that Mike and John and Ryan described how that state and local share calculation works. If we change the way our property taxes work, it will undermine that state and local share calculation. And then John, Mike, Ryan, is there anything you want to add to that? So again, just something to be aware of without overloading your brain. So
Howard, you're absolutely right. And that's what concerns me, because there is a limited pot of money that local taxing districts can try to tap into. And if this, my suggestion, definitely we're not afraid, and we should always reassess the way we study property taxes. No doubt about that. However, this is budget season, and we can't have that conversation being interspersed with the budgetary process that is occurring as we speak. That's a conversation that should happen outside of this. The whole funding formula was predicated on that which we knew, and that was a 20 mil floor, and everything else that was predictable. You pull that out, it's a Jenga ready to collapse. So it's important, if you have any influence at all on your legislators, yeah, study it, but outside the budget season. And I'll defer to the rest of you guys to see what you think about it.
One complicated thing is hard enough in a compressed period of time. Two complicated things that are interrelated with each other concerns me significantly. How that will play out. As a practical matter, it's going to be hard for well-meaning legislators who are trying to address two important problems. It will be hard for them to do it without some unintended consequences, is my concern. So putting any intentional, things that they might do aside, even the people trying to earnestly resolve these problems, there could be things that there was not enough time to figure out what the interactions would be.
Any further remarks from our panel? So I think we've come to the end of our gathering. I hope we all understand that this is complicated yet understandable. This is something we can understand, and this is something that we can act on. As you've found in your slides, there's the contact information for the Finance Committee. Please, if you care deeply about what happens in our public schools, this is the time to speak up, to take action, to ask for a fair school fund, a school funding system that is fair to every community and that guarantees that our children have the resources they need for a quality education. I want to thank the panelists for your expertise and for your teaching skills and for your lobbying skills, we hope, and that we hope to see you all at the State House. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.